In October, I spoke at the International Association of Chiefs of Police to try to talk to police officers about MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD and other police officers. And so we actually have a police psychotherapist who is now going through our training program to become trained and able to give MDMA to other police officers. And I met with his police chief just about a month ago. I'm from Boston, he's also from Boston, and we had a really terrific discussion. And I'm so used to thinking of the police as the predator and me as the prey that it was kind of difficult, over the years for me to develop the necessary compassion for the police. But now I understand how difficult of a job that is. And during this conversation, we talked about the other parts of our training program, one of which is where we give MDMA to therapists as part of their training. And so the police chief permitted his police officer to participate in that. So we're actually going to be giving MDMA to the police. So if there are any police officers here or DEA agents, you're welcome to participate in our training program. I also want to say, we heard this talk earlier about humility. So I'm getting a lot more credit than I really deserve. And if anybody's really responsible for the resurgence of psychedelic research, it's Stan Grof. And I also really want to honor David for the pioneering work that he did, both in science and in harm reduction, and also this concept of the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, of healthcare being a right. I think MAPS is a nonprofit pharmaceutical company, and I think what we see in America so much is the way that the profit motive has really warped healthcare in so many bad ways. And so I think the examples that David said early on, both science and medicine and harm reduction, and on trying to really see how this healthcare is really a right. And hopefully we'll get there at some point in America. So Stan Grof, as David said, psychedelics are the study of the mind, what the microscope is to biology and the telescope is to astronomy. And why is this really important? I think we're going to be talking mostly about medical applications, but I think what the hippies came to San Francisco for, and I think there's something more important even than medicine, which is the spirituality, this idea that psychedelics can help us break down the barriers between us and them, between our ego and the larger self, and that if you have these experiences of connection to everything, to nature, to other people, that then it's going to be harder to dehumanize others, and there'll be more compassion and empathy. And this sort of theory of change was written about by Robert Mueller, who was the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. And this was a book he wrote in 1983. And what he basically said is, we have the United Nations to mediate conflicts between countries, but a lot of these conflicts are actually religious-based. And so we need a sort of global spirituality. And it was a tremendous book, but he didn't say anything about psychedelics. So I wrote him a letter. I was just a college undergraduate at the time. And I said, will you help bring back psychedelic research? And he actually wrote me back, and he said that he would help. And so I think this, for me, was the confirmation of the theory of social change, that it's about this spirituality that we are needing in this kind of globalization world. But there's many, many different ways to achieve that. Psychedelics are not the only way, but they happen to be used for thousands of years for these purposes, and also they're more rapid, reliable, dangerous in some ways, but they are also tools that have been time-tested for thousands of years. So I think they should be among the tools that are really available, and Robert Mueller agreed with that. And there's a study now that's being done at Johns Hopkins and also at NYU. It's taking religious leaders from different religious traditions and then bringing them in to the lab essentially and getting psilocybin. And so in a sense, this is part of this search for the mystical core. Is there sort of a sense of spirituality that's common to all different religions, and then we just interpret them through our own historical symbol systems and prophets, and is there this common mystical core? And this is, I'd say, the most important study that's being done right now in the whole world in terms of psychedelics for the implications for the world. And so I just really want to acknowledge Roland Griffiths and Steve Ross and others that are doing this study. But to medicine, there's an incredible renaissance right now in psychedelic research all over the world. And we see, ketamine, S-ketamine has just been approved recently for the treatment of depression. There are studies with ketamine. Ayahuasca has been studied for depression, also psilocybin. There's 2 companies, one for-profit, one non-profit, trying to develop psilocybin into a medicine for depression. The FDA just declared psilocybin a breakthrough therapy for treatment-resistant depression. There's a series of studies, end-of-life distress, psilocybin, MDMA, and LSD. PTSD is MDMA and ayahuasca. For this group here, there's both the history from Bill W. from AA, and also now a series of very important studies with psychedelics for substance abuse, both ibogaine, ayahuasca, psilocybin, and MDMA. And there was, early work with LSD, with alcoholics and heroin addicts that was very promising. MDMA has been studied for social anxiety and psilocybin for OCD. And these are just some of the studies. There's an enormous amount of mechanism of action studies, and there's going to be studies in other clinical applications. So actually, we are further ahead than we were now in the 60s and the 50s. We're actually now into phase 3 studies, which are the final stage to make drugs into a medicine. So we've sort of lost 50 years, more or less, of research, but now we've recovered that ground and we're further ahead than ever before. And just to give you a sense of the Renaissance, I felt that several things were crucial to bring about the psychedelic Renaissance, and one was the study with LSD, the quintessential, dangerous psychedelic from the 60s. And so we were able to start LSD research after 35 years in Switzerland in 2008. And what I think is, for me, one of the proudest accomplishments of MAPS in our entire history is that we were able to get this study started several months before Albert Hofmann died at age 102. And his wife, Anita, died a few months before he did. So both Anita and Albert got to see the very beginnings of the renewal of the renaissance of psychedelic research with LSD research before they died. And so this was a study in Switzerland. This slide comes from May 30th, and a group of FDA officials from the Division of Psychiatry Products gave a presentation at the American Society for Clinical Psychopharmacology, and this is their slide. So I'd just like to say, we got Maria Sabina, mushrooms. So the FDA itself is putting out sort of psychedelic imagery here, and they're very excited about the renewal of psychedelic research, because in the Division of Psychiatry Products, they're aware that a lot of the drugs that they've approved have a relatively low effect size. They often have a large amount of side effects, and they're meant to be taken on a chronic basis. And so what we're really talking about with psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is very few acute administrations of psychedelics in combination with psychotherapy, with the goal being to help people become drug-free for their clinical indications. So that this is really, when people think about psychedelics, it's drug treatment, but really it's in contrast to a lot of what pharma is offering, in that these are meant, even with ketamine, they're only meant to be used a relatively few times. So we also have, there we go. The other big thing was bringing psychedelic research back to Harvard. So we had to bury the ghost of Timothy Leary. And just recently, I spoke at Harvard Business School. One of the other speakers there was George Goldsmith, who was the founder of Compass Pathways, the for-profit company developing psilocybin into a medicine. Also, there we go. I spoke also at Brigham and Women's Hospital, also affiliated with Harvard Medical School. This was the Division of Pharmacoepidemiology and Pharmacoeconomics. We're trying to really work out healthcare utilization data to figure out how to do it. And then one of the other things that's really coming together in a great way is, back when psychedelics were criminalized with the Controlled Substances Act in 1970, a lot of people who were interested in psychedelics went into meditation, and they felt that you have these experiences with psychedelics, but they're profound, but they fade, and so there needs to be kind of a daily practice or frequent practice to try to integrate and ground these experiences that people have with psychedelics. And so there was this kind of bifurcation where a bunch of people were saying, we've taken psychedelics, now Ram Dass sort of said, if you've got the message, you hang up the phone. And so there was this kind of division, in a way, where a lot of people who went into meditation, and particularly Zen, was very anti-psychedelic. And so I think what's really exciting to me is this coming together again of these sort of communities of spiritual, meditative communities and interest in psychedelics. And so there was just a study in lifelong Zen meditators done by a Zen leader in Switzerland, Vanya Palmers, who also, by the way, donated the Zendo. We have what's called the Zendo Project, where we do psychedelic harm reduction, following in the footsteps of Rock Med, where we do this at Burning Man and other festivals. And so Vanya donated the Zendo structure that we do a lot of this work in. But this study took lifelong Zen meditators to a meditation retreat in Lucerne. They went to University of Zurich before and after for brain scans. And in the middle of their meditation retreat, they got a pill, and it was either psilocybin or placebo. And they wanted to see, how does this impact their brain scans? How does it impact their meditation practice? How does it impact their psychology? And what they found is that this really enhances people's meditation, even if they haven't taken psychedelics for decades and decades. And again, it's not like you take psychedelics all the time. One time helps people experience certain things that then they can ground in practice for many months or years to come. So this was published in Neuroimage. I'd really encourage anybody to connect this, because I think this is one of the, again, signs of the sort of renaissance of psychedelics, is that the spirituality meditation community is now finally willing to weave in and integrate the use of psychedelics into their practices. Now, this is, of course, not everybody, but this is happening. And then this is a call to action from neuroscientists at Stanford for MDMA, which is not a classic psychedelic, but this was in Cell 3 years ago. The world's populations need more compassion and empathy for one another. The study of MDMA provides one small but potentially important step towards reaching that goal. So that was 3 years ago, and then just 2 days ago, they published in JAMA Psychiatry what they call disruptive psychopharmacology. So for Silicon Valley and for the Bay Area, that's kind of really good language, disruptive psychopharmacology. And it was in JAMA Psychiatry, one of the leading psychiatric journals, and they talked about the therapeutic utility of MDMA and psilocybin. So this is really becoming very mainstream. And so here's the MAPS. So MAPS, I started 33 years ago as a nonprofit psychedelic and medical marijuana pharmaceutical company. And now, over the history of MAPS, we've raised about $75 million in donations. When we added it up, it was kind of astonishing. And now it's becoming possible to at least envision that we might succeed with making MDMA-assisted psychotherapy into a medicine for PTSD. And so if that does become a medicine, then we would like to actually supplement the donations that we receive by earned income from the sale of MDMA as a medicine. And so we are a pharmaceutical company. We are trying to make that happen. And yet, as I said, I think the profit motive warps the medical care a lot. But there's a modification of capitalism called the benefit corporation, where what you do, the B Corp, where you maximize social benefit, not profit. So we're trying to model that as well. So MAPS has created a for-profit public benefit corporation that's conducting our research and will, at the same time, if we get approval from FDA, sell MDMA at a reasonable profit, and then those funds will be used for more research. So it's for-profit. There's only one investor, which is the nonprofit. So what this slide illustrates is people donate to the nonprofit invests in the public benefit corp, the benefit corp does the research and will hopefully get approval from FDA and European Medicines Agency and the rest around the world to actually market MDMA, so kind of a virtuous circle. And how it works is that MDMA is off patent, but in 1984, Ronald Reagan signed a bill to provide incentives for developing drugs that were off patent. So this applies to LSD, psilocybin, marijuana, all these drugs that are in the public domain. And what the incentives are, it's called data exclusivity. It means that no one can use our data to market a generic drug for 5 years. And if you do pediatric studies, which is the FDA is noticing lots of times, people do studies in adults, but then they're marketed in children without any kind of scientific data. So the FDA is actually requiring us, if we succeed with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD in adults, we must then do what are called phase 4 studies, which are post-approval for 12 to 17-year-olds with trauma. And if that works, we have to go down to 7 to 11-year-olds. And there's a lot of kids traumatized. And so you get extra 6 months data exclusivity. And it takes FDA at least 6 months to review a generic manufacturer's application. So more or less 6 years of data exclusivity in the US and 8 years to 10 years in Europe. So we also have a strong set of bipartisan supporters for our research. And this, I think, is really crucial for the mainstreaming. This is not just coming from, hippies from San Francisco. It's really coming from Rebecca Mercer as well. So, she was, her father actually owned Cambridge Analytica, which was the group that sort of stole a bunch of data from Facebook and micro-targeted people for Trump. They're the main funders of Trump and Steve Bannon, but Rebecca Mercer donated $1 million to MAPS for our phase 3 MDMA PTSD research. And the only limitation was that go to veterans in our phase 3 studies, which is no problem because we have a lot of veterans in our studies. We've also received $900,000 a year for 3 years from the Koch family. So from Elizabeth Koch, whose father is Charles Koch, and she's actually has a nonprofit herself for consciousness research. And we go the entire spectrum from George Soros as well, from the Open Society Foundation. They've been one of our funders. And George, in particular, the Open Society Foundation funded this project that we have coming up in August, which is training for therapists of color. What we've noticed is that almost all of our subjects are white. There are some Hispanics. There's very, very few African Americans. And so what we realized to bring more diversity into the patient population, because the people that suffer from PTSD or suffer from anxiety and depression are actually more likely to be people of color than not. And so we've got this training coming up. The Libra Foundation, which is based here in San Francisco for human rights, they've also donated towards this. River Styx, Dr. Bronner's, other foundations have really come in to help for this. So MAPS is now about 55 people, all to 60 people. We're growing pretty rapidly, all funded by donations. This is the MAP side, the various different things that we do: fundraising, communications, media operations, our Zendo psychedelic harm reduction, and we have a small advocacy team. And then this is the clinical team. And I'm proud to say that this is composed or led by refugees from Big Pharma. So most of them are from Novartis. And what's really beautiful about that is that Novartis bought Sandoz. And Sandoz is the company that Albert Hofmann worked at when he invented LSD and where he synthesized psilocybin. So in a sense, we have the legacy of the psychedelic pharmaceuticals companies from Sandoz, and now our leadership team is all from Novartis. And then these are our therapy training supervisors and our principal investigators. We have some of the leading principal investigators involved in PTSD research in America and around the world. And we're training lots and lots of therapists. So the key idea that I'd really like to leave you with is that MDMA is not the treatment. LSD is not the treatment. None of these drugs are the treatment in and of themselves, like pharmacotherapies are. It's psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. And that's the key part, is it's the context. As Stan Grof, as David talked about, it's their tools, and they can be used well, they can be used poorly. But in order to be used well, we need to train therapists in how to work with them. So we've had a whole series of training programs all over the world, and one is happening right now at the Marconi Center. So we've just been starting to train several hundred therapists. Because once it's approved as a medicine, only therapists that have been trained in our method will be able to prescribe it. So this is the bigger vision for MAPS in the future. Again, the nonprofit's down at the bottom. At the very top is the Public Benefit Corporation. The dark lines are things that MAPS would own or control. MAPS Public Benefit Corporation does the clinical research. We also have our therapy training program out of it, and then expanded access is compassionate use that's going to come as well. We've started MAPS Europe to bring MDMA to Europe, and we'll have other companies. And then the future expansions are developing cannabis, ibogaine, or ayahuasca into medicines, again, through this sort of combination nonprofit public benefit corporation context. We haven't started any of those. Well, we've got little steps to these other things, but really we're focusing on MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. The first expansions, though, are going to be other uses of MDMA than just PTSD. MDMA-assisted psychotherapy can be for a large number of different things. So there's a study conducted by Dr. Ben Sessa that's right now MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for alcoholism. Because a lot of what drives alcoholism and trauma is trauma. A lot of driving drug abuse is trauma. If you can help people deal with the traumas, then they don't need to escape so much into alcoholism or drug abuse. There's also a study that we finished that's written about in the Journal of Psychoactive Drugs that you all have on MDMA for social anxiety in adults on the autism spectrum, which was very promising results. MDMA for anxiety associated with life-threatening illness. We're starting now, we're in the protocol development stage for MDMA for eating disorders. And there's a lot of anecdotal reports of people with eating disorders who've done MDMA either recreational or non-medical settings and reported that it helped them address their eating disorder problems. So this is Adele LaFrance is going to be coordinating this study. And we've done 2 studies in ibogaine. I would say from my perspective, after MDMA, the most important psychedelic research that needs to be done. There is these 2 companies, as I said, with psilocybin for depression, so that's moving forward. But the most important thing that's not moving forward, I think, is ibogaine for opiate addiction. Ibogaine helps people go through the withdrawal process, and it also gives them psychological support. So you have to go through withdrawal, but then how do you prevent relapse? And ibogaine can actually help in both of those processes. So we've done observational studies in New Zealand and also in Mexico, and both of them were promising. It's kind of a perverse situation here in America in that ibogaine is illegal. It's not a drug of abuse. It just so happened that in the 60s, a bunch of LSD dealers were experimenting with all sorts of stuff, and they got busted, and they also had ibogaine. And so the police said, oh, let's criminalize this. And it was the same group of people that were also experimenting with opiates, and they learned that ibogaine helped them through their opiate withdrawals. And so that's how that developed, really. But ibogaine, I believe, is crucially important to move forward with. Ayahuasca is a drug that is used for religious services. It's 2 different churches are legal in the United States, the União de Vegetal and the Santo Daime. But this woman, Victoria Hale, started One World Health. These are 2 San Francisco-based companies. One World Health got $150 million from the Gates Foundation for Drugs for Africa, and Medicines 360 got a bunch of money from the Buffetts and others for low-cost IUDs for contraception for also Africa and other areas. And she's since had some profound personal experiences with ayahuasca. And so she's talking about working with MAPS to try to help bring ayahuasca through the scientific process, through the FDA process, to see what it can be used for. And chances are, we've discussed it several times, but it looks like the most important indication will be ayahuasca for substance abuse. And there's a lot of people that are going down to South America for ayahuasca for substance abuse. Ayahuasca circles all throughout America as well, and Europe. But I think that's very important and another thing worthy to develop. And we are also doing marijuana project. We're the first one ever to have done a controlled study of marijuana for PTSD in 76 U.S. veterans. It was done in Arizona with $2.1 million from the state of Colorado from all of their marijuana tax money. And we tested 4 different kinds, THC, CBD, THC, CBD combination, and placebo. We're still writing up the results, so I can't say much about that. But in the state of Michigan, there was the legalization of marijuana was passed. And in that bill, put in there by the Marijuana Policy Project, was this clause saying that they have to put $20 million a year for 2 years into FDA-approved clinical studies sponsored by nonprofit or university-based researchers studying efficacy of marijuana in medically treating U.S. armed service veterans and in preventing veteran suicides. So how this money will actually be used is up for competition, and we'll be trying to get some of this to develop marijuana into a medicine for PTSD. But it's really just about controlling symptoms. It isn't about a cure. It isn't about making people free of drugs. So our preference, top priority is MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD, but many people do use cannabis for this. The big problem with cannabis, and this is where the only place we talk about an open door to psychedelic research from a regulatory perspective, that's really true. The only place where there is political obstruction of research with Schedule I drugs right now is marijuana, ironically. And so there has been a monopoly on the supply of marijuana that's DEA licensed, that is federally legal, that can be used in FDA research, because FDA can only use federally legal marijuana. And so this is Dr. El Soli. It's grown at the University of Mississippi under contract to NIDA. And the thing about this is that NIDA can only provide marijuana to research, not for commercial sales. And so phase 3 research, the key studies that you use to make drugs into medicines, must be conducted with the exact same drug you want to market. So as long as NIDA has the monopoly and there's no private DEA licensed production of marijuana, there's no way we can do phase 3 studies. We can potentially import from, but nobody yet from either Canada, Israel, or the other countries have opened up what's called a drug master file and persuaded the FDA that they have medical grade marijuana. So at this stage, our main thing is we have to break the federal monopoly, which we've been working on since 2000. And so I think this year or early next year, we should be able to end this monopoly. So that's kind of a big picture. The other thing that's not really medicine that's really important that we're doing is that it turns out there's Israelis and Palestinians using ayahuasca together, and sometimes using MDMA together. This is sort of underground illegal. It's sort of peace activist on both sides. But we're wanting to study in conjunction with Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris at Imperial College how these psychedelics have been helpful in people in crossing different kind of barriers. And that gets back to, as I first talked about, Robert Muller's from the UN, his idea of mysticism being the antidote to fundamentalism. How do we build these bridges between people? But all of that aside, what we're doing is making MDMA into a medicine. And it took a lot of strategy and thinking, what drug, what condition. We needed a condition that was not adequately treated by currently available medicines, or at least that there was large numbers of treatment-resistant people. And PTSD is that treatment. MDMA is the most gentle of all the psychedelics. And so we put MDMA, PTSD together. So that's our sort of strategy for moving forward with psychedelics. And SSRIs are available for PTSD, but they don't work that well. They are just symptom reduction. They have side effects. They require daily dosing. A lot of people don't like them. And there are psychotherapies that work quite well for a lot of people, but they still leave a lot of people treatment resistant, because it's very difficult to confront your traumas when they're so painful, even with skilled psychotherapists. So they have high dropout rates. And this is 3 years ago. The more recent figures, I don't have a slide yet, but in September of 2018, there was 1,036,000 veterans receiving disability payments for PTSD. Right here in 3 years ago, 1.4 million vets receiving disability payments for mental health disorders. And there's no numbers that the VA puts out as far as how much this costs them, but it's somewhere in the neighborhood of $15 or $20 billion a year. And these are mostly young people, veterans, mostly young people. There are some Vietnam vets still here, but so this is just an enormous crisis in America, not just talking about financial concerns, but emotional suffering. And PTSD changes people's brains. So people who have PTSD have hyperactive amygdalas, where we process fear, reduction in activity in the prefrontal cortex, where people think logically, and reduction in activity in the hippocampus, where we store events into long-term memory. And MDMA changes people's brains too, but pretty much in the opposite way. Oops. So what MDMA does, and these are fMRI studies from healthy volunteers who've gone into scanners. And so MDMA reduces activity in the amygdala so that people can process painful emotions. It's not so triggering. It increases activity in the prefrontal cortex, so you can think more logically about what happened and separate it from triggers that might remind you of something but aren't the same thing. And it increases connectivity between the hippocampus and the amygdala that permits the processing of fear-based memories from sort of short-term memory to long-term memory, so that you can put it into the past. MDMA releases serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine, and it releases hormones, oxytocin, prolactin, vasopressin, and cortisol. And a recent study that I really learned a lot about from MDMA was in octopuses. So this was done by neuroscientists at Johns Hopkins. And it turns out that humans and octopuses diverged about 500 million years ago. And octopuses still do have serotonin receptors. So what do they do in octopuses? And so the question for these neuroscientists was, how deep in our evolutionary history does this pro-social effect of MDMA actually go? And so what they did was, they have an octopus in a center chamber. The octopus could go in one of two directions. One is to an inanimate object, the other is to another octopus. And what they find is that under normal conditions, the octopuses are solitary unless it's mating season. So they spend way more time with the inanimate object than the other octopus. But you soak the octopus in a bath of MDMA for 10 minutes. It took them a little while to figure out the right doses, but they figured that out. And then you stick the octopus back in the same chamber, and lo and behold, now they want to hang out with other octopuses. So when we talk earlier about working with children with trauma, particularly if we need to go down to 7 to 11-year-olds, what this shows in the octopuses, I think it applies to humans, is that this pro-social effect of MDMA is so deep, it's pre-verbal, it's wired in, it's hardwired into us. And so it's likely to be helpful for children that are traumatized. These same group of researchers did studies in mice. This was just published 2 months ago in Nature. And what they showed is that MDMA releases oxytocin, and that they hypothesized that that's behind the increase in the therapeutic alliance between the patient and the therapist, that this oxytocin release, and that they showed neural sprouting, that MDMA actually can increase neural connections. It's not neurogenesis, and that's, although it may be happening, this study didn't prove that, but what they did demonstrate is that neural sprouting and new neural connections are made in prosocial areas of the brain. And that can account for how you can have one experience or several that has long-term lasting benefits. In terms of mechanism of action, the early work with LSD and psilocybin in the 50s and 60s, and the current work with psilocybin has shown that there's a correlation between the mystical experience and therapeutic outcome for the treatment of anxiety associated for people with life-threatening illnesses, for addictions. There's this spiritual experience that's correlated with therapeutic outcome. So we use the same questionnaire in MDMA therapy to measure spiritual experiences. And we've shown that the active doses, actually people do score fairly high. 0.6 means a full mystical experience, and the mean there was 0.46. So people are doing pretty well in terms of this kind of questionnaire of spiritual experience with MDMA, not as much as with the classic psychedelics, but there's no correlation. And that's the fundamental difference in mechanism of action between the classic psychedelics and MDMA. In PTSD, you need to be grounded in your biography, you need to be thinking about the trauma, feeling the trauma as an intact ego, and processing it in a different way and not so fearful and freaking out. So we don't try to steer people to mystical experiences in any way at all when they're under the influence of MDMA. We sort of support them in what's emerging in whatever order it emerges. Now, the psychotherapy itself is part of a mechanism of action, your therapeutic approach. And so the strategy that we've adopted now is that we are actually reaching out to the leading PTSD researchers in the world who've developed non-drug psychotherapies. And they know that they work in many conditions, but they have certain groups of people that are treatment resistant. And so we're actually paying them to study how to blend MDMA with existing non-drug psychotherapies. This is our effort to educate the VA, basically. And it's kind of ridiculous. A little tiny nonprofit is paying this enormous bureaucracy to learn about MDMA. But for political reasons, they're not yet there, ready to pay for it, but this is a really good strategy. So the first study that we've actually completed was with Candace Monson. She was deputy director of the Boston VA in charge of women's health, and she developed cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy, which is couples therapy where one member has PTSD and it affects the relationship, and we give both members of the dyad MDMA. And so it really helps reduce the PTSD in the person that's suffering from PTSD, and it helps a lot with the relationships as well. So we're kind of backdoor into MDMA for couples therapy. There's also cognitive processing therapy. This is Ann Wagner, and so we're funding her to do a study blending MDMA with cognitive processing therapy. Barbara Rothbaum is at Emory University. She's going to be blending MDMA with prolonged exposure. And sort of the queen of PTSD research is Edna Foa, who developed prolonged exposure. We just recently met in Israel. And so she's also going to be doing a study that we're funding, a treatment development study to blend MDMA with prolonged exposure. So in 1990 is when I first started to try to sponsor research inside the Veterans Administration. That was here at the UC San Francisco VA, and the psychiatrists and therapists that were involved in that really wanted to help their patients, but it was blocked politically. And so now, 29 years later, Rachel Yehuda, who's one of the leading PTSD researchers, and she's also very prominent in the field of epigenetics. So she did studies with Holocaust survivors and their children to show that you can be passing down sort of set points for anxiety and depression and other things through the generations, even if people were not directly exposed themselves. They can get it from their mothers. And so Rachel is likely to get permission inside the Bronx VA. And if so, that'll be sort of the end of a 29-year cycle trying to get the VA to do research. And she's going to use our method, and she's going to compare 2 MDMA sessions with associated non-drug psychotherapy sessions versus 3. And here in UC San Francisco, one of the other most important things from an economic point of view is going to be doing group therapy. So we'll be working with Brian Anderson at UC San Francisco to do a study combining group therapy with some elements of cognitive processing therapy. And at Yale, this is going to be the first study. We're not funding this, but we've trained them and we're providing MDMA. But this is going to be the first study taking PTSD patients, giving them MDMA and sticking them in a scanner. So it's not a treatment study, it's a mechanism of action study, but we also are tracking their PTSD symptoms. So in a way, this is a study of as close as we can get ethically to what does MDMA do by itself to people who are not in an intensive psychotherapeutic process, but are supported through this fMRI process, and will that help them with their PTSD? And then this is our highest ranking military supporter, retired Brigadier General Lori Sutton. She's head of Veterans Affairs now for the city of New York. And she said, when it comes to the health and well-being of those who serve, we should leave our politics at the door and not be afraid to follow the data. There's now an evidence base for this MDMA therapy and a plausible story of what may be going on in the brain to account for the effects. And so I think really we have an open door from a regulatory perspective, from bipartisan political support and funding support. And so really now it's up to us to prove it scientifically if we can. So MDMA was invented in 1912 by Merck. They were trying to evade a competitor's patent to get to a drug. They patented everything along their new route. MDMA was it. They had no idea what they had. They weren't really even interested in it. And they did nothing with it till, let's see. Well, they did nothing with it. There we go. Nothing with it till 1927. Their patent was getting ready to expire. They tested it in animals. They found nothing interesting. The animals didn't say, oh, I love my fellow animal. And so they abandoned it. The next we hear about it, the U.S. Army Chemical Warfare Service, CA, MK Ultra Mind Control, is studying different drugs in animals for potential military use, and MDMA was one of those drugs that they tested in animals, but this was classified and not declassified until the early 70s, so nobody really knew this was going on. And then, for some reason, Merck in '59 decided to test MDMA again, and again they found nothing interesting, and they abandoned it, until Sasha Shulgin, one of our heroes here in the Bay Area, was his first experience actually with psychedelics was with mescaline, and he found it very, very spiritual. And he started looking at developing new drugs that would be legal, that could be used in therapy. And he kind of helped rediscover MDMA with his wife, Ann Shulgin, and they gave it to this fellow, Leo Zeff, who we call the secret chief. Leo was the leader of the underground psychedelic therapy movement, and he was about to retire, but when he heard about MDMA, he called it penicillin of the soul. And he ended up training therapists and psychiatrists, and roughly 500,000 doses were used, much of it manufactured by students at MIT. and shipped all over the world, and particularly in America. And so there was roughly 500,000 doses were used in these therapeutic settings. So for many people, you may not be aware that MDMA was a therapy drug before it was a party drug. And one of the people that experienced this in this therapeutic personal growth setting decided to make it into ecstasy. Called it ecstasy, started being used in Star Club in Dallas, being sold in public, and it was, at that point, obvious that it was going to be criminalized because this was now being used in a public setting at the same time of Nancy Reagan and just saying no. So we knew it was doomed. I learned about MDMA in 1982 from Debbie Harlow, who's back there, which I'd like to thank you for introducing me to MDMA. My life would be totally different if you hadn't showed up at Esalen at that point. But I was very much foolish in the sense that I was not that interested. When Debbie started talking about MDMA, she's like, oh, it helps you feel love. It helps you feel connection. It helps you talk to people. It helps you be a better listener. And so I lacked a certain amount of humility, and so I'll say I thought I was fine. I love people. I can listen good. And then I saw a group of people sitting in a circle doing MDMA, and I was like, how profound can it be? You take a bunch of LSD, you can't talk. If you're sitting around talking to people, it must be very mild and not very useful. So I was foolish enough to underestimate it, but smart enough to buy some. And then when I tried it, I was shocked profoundly at how incredibly helpful it was. And so we started a nonprofit before MAPS with Debbie, myself, and Lee Sagar, and we gathered support. Once the DEA moved to criminalize MDMA in the summer of '84, I went to Washington. That's a picture of me there, right before I walked in the door of the DEA to file a lawsuit asking for a hearing, which we managed to get. In the hearing and in the PR, so we started winning in the courts and winning in the court of public opinion. And through some of the people that Robert Mueller had introduced me to from the UN, one was Brother David Steinelrost. He said a monk spends his whole life cultivating the same awakened attitude it gives you. This is my favorite, though. This was, well, there we go, Zalman Schachter, a rabbi. He said, you call the Sabbath a delight. MDMA is like the Sabbath at the end of a long week. So we're winning in the courts, winning in the court of public opinion. The DEA freaked out, and so they emergency scheduled MDMA in the summer of 1985. The interesting thing about this is that they did not have the power to do emergency scheduling. Congress gave it to the Attorney General. Attorney General had never subdelegated it down to the DEA. So the first move to criminalize MDMA was a crime. And a bunch of people that got arrested during that period got released until they filed the formal paperwork so that they could keep it illegal. The judge eventually said MDMA should become Schedule III. And so it was frustrating. We knew we couldn't win through the legal system, and so the DEA rejected the recommendation of the judge. So in '86 is when I started MAPS. That's Debbie there in the background. And so that was 33 years ago. And I knew that the only way back is through science, through medicine, through the rigorous process that the FDA has. Fortunately, I was not aware that no drug had ever been made into a medicine by a nonprofit at that time. And that didn't happen until 1999, and that was the abortion pill RU46, funded by the Rockefellers, the Pritzkers, and the Buffetts through the Population Council. So MAPS was started in '86. The first 5 protocols were all rejected. I was the only employee of MAPS for the first 7 years. And because all of our projects were being rejected, and because I was also rejected for clinical psych PhD programs, because I wanted to do MDMA research, I felt the politics was in the way of the science, so I should study the politics. So that's where I ended up going to Harvard, to the Kennedy School of Government, where I got my master's and PhD in the regulation of the medical use of psychedelics and marijuana. So the rejections actually helped me get more mainstream, helped me get legitimate. But in '92, the FDA, a group of people at the FDA took over. This is now due to people in the Bay Area and others, the AIDS movement, the people that were very concerned about HIV were pressuring the FDA to speed up the development of drugs. They were saying that they were too slow, that they were overemphasizing preventing risk and not looking at helping patients. And so the FDA started a new group in 1990 called the Pilot Drug Evaluation Staff to test new ways to move drugs through the FDA faster. And that group got the psychedelics to regulate, and they wanted to see research. And so in 92, they had a advisory committee meeting that said, yes, they will open the door to psychedelic research in marijuana, and they'll regulate it the same way they regulate any other drug from big pharma. And so DEA, ONDCP, NIDA, all those people were in the room. And they heard, oh, okay, FDA is going to regulate psychedelics the way they regulate every other drug. Nothing is ever going to get out the other end, so we'll let the FDA do that. And so the first study that they permitted us to do was with Charlie Grobe, which was a phase 1 dose-response safety study. That took us through the 90s. In 2000, we did a study in Spain, and unfortunately, or fortunately, we got good media coverage, but that alerted the Madrid Anti-Drug Authority, and they shut the study down for political reasons. So that was heartbreaking. Then we started trying to do research back in the US. The FDA said yes. 7 different IRBs rejected the protocol, which was, again, once one IRB says no, you have to tell the next IRB that the first one said no. So you end up carrying this big list of no's. And so MAPS, we started our own IRB. And I thought, okay, now we have a way to go forward, but it's not so great that you authorize yourself. It's not as good. So I decided that I would try one last effort to get IRB approval, and I saw this one IRB called the Copernicus Group. And I figured if anybody is sensitive to religious political pressure against science, it would be the Copernicus Group. And lo and behold, yeah, they ended up approving the study. So we were able to start it. We've published a bunch of papers in our phase 2 studies. These are the first 2. What's important about the second one is we did a 3.5-year follow-up to the study and showed that people actually keep getting better over time on average, that this helps people process trauma. And once you learn you don't have to suppress it, you can process it, you can keep getting better on your own. We did these other pilot studies in veterans, firefighters, and police officers, and this was one in Boulder. This was our pooled analysis. And so we've published all these papers, but it was 30 years from the time that we started MAPS to the time we had an end of phase 2 meeting at the FDA. And at that meeting, these are the results that we presented. So the first thing is we had 105 people in studies in Israel, Switzerland, the United States, and Canada. Different small studies. We're testing different drugs, different doses, different comparator doses, trying to figure out how to do double-blind studies. These are all the doses that we tested. We found that the 75 to 125 were the really therapeutically effective dose range. And when I say that, we also give half the initial dose after 2 hours. It's an 8-hour therapy session with 2 therapists. And the things that we learned in phase 2, first off, we learned that the cause of PTSD is irrelevant to the treatment. The SSRIs work better in women than in men, and they failed completely in combat-related PTSD. But we found it didn't matter, complex PTSD, anything like that. Also, low doses did enhance the blinding, but they had a problem in that they seemed to have an anti-therapeutic effect. People still got better, but they were more anxious. They were activated without the fear being reduced, and so we had this problem of the therapy with inactive placebo did better than the therapy with low-dose MDMA. But the therapy with low-dose MDMA did produce blinding. So there's a trade-off here, how to do these studies. Also, we showed that it can be done safely and that there was a medium to large effect size. So I opened up the meeting with the FDA by saying this quote, "There's a Harvard man on the wrong side of every question." And I said, in that case, it was me. My dissertation was about how to solve the double-blind problem, and I thought it was low dose versus full dose, all combined with therapy. But that would actually make it easier to find a difference between the 2 groups. So I said there's no solution to the double-blind problem with psychedelics, at least with MDMA. And so what we proposed is that we do this with inactive therapy plus inactive placebo versus therapy plus active MDMA. We had very minimal, this just very quickly, side effects. They faded over time. Some were even more in the control group than in the others, like headaches, fatigue. Because again, people that are traumatized, if they don't get the help from MDMA, it's a very difficult process. We did neuropsych tests for those people concerned about neurotoxicity. Before and after, there was no reductions at all, so we demonstrated safety in that way. The people that were in the control group, 23%, now these are chronic, on average, severe treatment-resistant PTSD patients. 23% no longer had PTSD at the primary outcome measure, which was 1 to 2 months after the treatment. These are the people that are basically MDMA with, therapy with no MDMA or very low-dose MDMA. 23% no longer had PTSD, which is really pretty good for that group. But you add MDMA, and it goes up to 61%. And then when you do the 1-year follow-up, it's all the way at 68%. 2/3 no longer have PTSD. So it's really, really remarkable how the results are. FDA said yes to moving to phase 3. We engaged in special protocol assessment, which delayed it 7 months, but we have an agreement with FDA. If we get statistically significant evidence of efficacy and no new safety problems arise, then FDA will approve the drug. We also have and this is the protocol that we're using, 3 MDMA sessions, 1 month apart with 12 90-minute non-drug psychotherapy sessions, 3 before the first for preparation and 3 after each one for integration. We've got breakthrough therapy, and we've had meetings with DEA and FDA also about this expanded access that's coming right up. These are our phase 3 locations. And we've trained the new therapists as well. And so this is the results from our training program where each new therapist team gets 1 patient, I'm almost done, where they get 1 patient open label where they work under supervision. So 58% had a remission, which is CAPS score under 11 for CAPS 5. When you talk about loss of PTSD diagnosis, which is CAPS of reduction of at least 10 points and also not having diagnosed, 74%, and treatment response is up to 94%. So it's incredible how MDMA really enhances the therapeutic process. We've also met with the European Medicines Agency. They'll accept the FDA data. These are the studies in Europe, the site, and I've even just recently been in China. And one of our donors wants us to bring MDMA to China. And so we're trying to globalize it. But now here's the key question is, how is it regulated once it's approved? So there is this expanded access. We're going to be able to open up clinics this year in 2019 where people can pay for their treatment, open label, no control group, because there's so many people with PTSD. We'll be able to fill up the phase 3. But the FDA has what are called these REMS, risk evaluation and mitigation strategies. And so what they're going to basically be is that only people that we've trained can prescribe it. It's only administered under direct supervision. It's never a take-home drug. There's certain kind of safety parameters that must be followed, and there's a centralized pharmacy that ships to the doctors, not to the patients. And there might be a patient registry or a total lifetime limit, but we don't think so. Those are still to be negotiated. We have this manualized therapy method. We have all these adherence raters, adherence competencies. We have this whole training program. And eventually what's going to be happening is psychedelic clinics. So right now there's 14,500 drug abuse treatment facilities, 6,100 hospice centers, 33,000 yoga Pilates studios. I think there'll eventually be thousands and thousands and thousands of psychedelic clinics. One of them will be like this, beautiful ones. Others will be in the city, like this. And you'll go to Google Maps and say, where's my nearest psychedelic clinic, like Weed Maps. And I think my long-term goal from 18 years old and when I was in 1972 was to become a legal psychedelic therapist. And so I think in 2022, after we have MDMA approved in the US and Europe, I will be able to do that. So thank you very much.